Microsoft. They're claiming that they're trying to merge them in Windows 8. They're lying. They're not. They're full of shit.
I think from an OS perspective, they just suck.
Look at your computer for a second. Not the screen, not the apps, not the wallpaper. Think about the relationship you actually have with the machine in front of you. Do you own it, or are you just renting access to it on someone else's terms? For most people, that question used to sound philosophical. Today, it is starting to sound very real, very fast. For more than 2 decades, one person has been warning about this moment. Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux, has been one of the few people blunt enough to say what others would not. He has called out Microsoft when it tried to undermine open source.
And from a morals perspective, they suck even more.
He has mocked corporate spin when it pretended to embrace what it could not control. And, for most of that time, the world treated him like the grumpy engineer who just could not move on. The story you are about to hear is not about fanboy wars or old grudges. It is about how one company learned to take the thing that threatened it most, open source, and turn it into something harmless. It is about how the operating system became the least important part of your computer, and why that should worry you much more than any blue screen of death ever did. To understand why Linus Torvalds was right about Microsoft, we first have to go back to when the company did not pretend to love open source at all. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, internal Microsoft memos that later became known as the Halloween documents showed executives studying free software as a serious strategic threat. They talked openly about using fear, uncertainty, and doubt to slow its adoption, rather than trying to beat it on technical merit or price. Around the same time, then Chief Executive Steve Ballmer summed up the attitude in one now infamous line. He called Linux a cancer in an intellectual property sense, something that would spread and contaminate everything it touched. This was not an off-the-cuff joke. It reflected a worldview in which open-source licenses and collaborative development were existential dangers to the software business model Microsoft had built. Linus Torvalds pushed back, sometimes with harsh language of his own, but the core of his argument was simple. He believed open development, where users can study and change the code that runs their machines, is a kind of immune system for the technology world. In interviews over the years, he accused Microsoft of preferring legal and political tactics over straightforward technical competition, and warned that their sudden friendliness to open source was often tactical rather than ideological. At the same time, Torvalds was never a cartoon hater. In later comments, he even said that blind Microsoft hatred was a disease, and acknowledged that the company could contribute useful code and work with open source when it suited them. That nuance is important. His concern was not that Microsoft was always evil. It was that Microsoft would always do what aligned with its long-term control over platforms, regardless of how friendly the marketing sounded in the moment. Then, starting around the mid-2000s, the script seemed to flip. A new chief executive took over. The company started contributing code to the Linux kernel, launched Microsoft Loves Linux campaigns, and put Linux workloads front and center on its cloud platform. They even released a subsystem that allowed Linux applications to run inside Windows itself. Suddenly, the company that had once treated Linux as a disease was talking about collaboration, interoperability, and respect. The turning point for many people came when Microsoft bought GitHub, the largest public platform for open-source software development. Overnight, the place where millions of developers hosted their code and coordinated their work belonged to the same corporation that had once tried to slow open-source adoption. Microsoft assured everyone that GitHub would remain independent, that it would respect licenses, and that it would support the community. For a while, that promise seemed to hold. This is where the core problem starts to come into focus. It is not about one acquisition, one product, or one bad feature. It is about a pattern that spans years. Microsoft has consistently moved up the stack, away from the operating system itself, and into the infrastructure that sits above it. Cloud hosting, developer platforms, AI models, collaboration tools. In that world, Linux is no longer a rival to be crushed. It is a useful component to be absorbed, managed, and eventually made irrelevant to the parts of computing where control and profit live. Look at GitHub Copilot. This AI coding assistant was trained on huge amounts of public code, much of it from GitHub repositories published under open source licenses. Developers have accused the companies behind it of ignoring license terms that require attribution and the preservation of copyright notices. They argue that Copilot can sometimes reproduce code in ways that look suspiciously close to direct copying, without telling users where that code came from or what obligations attach to it. The legal fight over Copilot is still playing out, but the ethical pattern is clear. Public code, written by thousands of volunteers and companies under specific rules, is treated as raw fuel for a proprietary AI service. The service itself is closed, sold as a subscription, and does not automatically point users back to the communities and projects that created the original code. Critics argue that if this model wins, open source developers risk becoming unpaid data providers for corporate AI, instead of equal participants in a shared ecosystem. Now zoom out from developers to everyday Windows users. Over the last decade, more and more parts of the Windows experience have become locked down or tied to online accounts and cloud services. System telemetry, the data your machine sends back about usage and performance, has become harder or impossible to fully disable in standard editions. Default settings nudge users toward the company's browser, cloud storage, and search services, and those defaults can quietly reassert themselves after updates. When Windows 11 arrived, it came with new requirements that sounded technical but had deep implications. Trusted platform module hardware and secure boot became part of the baseline, presented as necessary for security. Many users found that installing or even setting up the system without a company account required workarounds. The pattern here is less about one requirement and more about direction. Each generation gives the vendor more leverage over who can run the system, under what conditions, and with which services attached. Then came one of the clearest examples of what happens when that leverage is combined with ambitious new features. Recall is a Windows feature that takes regular snapshots of what appears on your screen and stores them so that an AI system can help you search your past activity. The pitch is convenience. You can find anything you have seen on your device. Critics, including security researchers, pointed out that such a feature also creates a detailed log of your digital life, from browsing and messaging to financial and medical information. Early versions of Recall drew outrage because of how and where that data was stored and how easy it could be for malware or a local attacker to grab it. In response, Microsoft delayed rollout, added protections, and shifted it to an explicitly opt-in feature on specific AI-focused PCs. Supporters say this shows the company can course correct. Skeptics argue that the important fact is that the feature was conceived and built in the first place, and that, in practice, opt-in settings have a way of becoming more aggressive over time. This brings us to the bigger picture, the part that Linus Torvalds warned about long before Copilot or Recall even existed. When the operating system was the main product, control meant licensing and distribution. Today, control lives higher up. It lives in the cloud platforms that host your apps, the AI services that process your data, and the accounts that tie all your devices together. You can run Linux on your laptop and still depend on a handful of proprietary services for your work, communication, and storage. For an ordinary user, that shift can feel invisible. The system boots, the apps launch, files sync. But layer by layer, meaningful choice erodes. Terms of service can change without negotiation. A feature that used to run locally now requires a cloud connection. A tool that was free becomes part of a paid subscription. When the ecosystem is tightly integrated, the cost of saying no to any single change increases. You are not deciding between one browser and another. You are deciding whether to break your workflow. For developers, the risk is different but related. If the main place where code is discovered, discussed, and even written is owned by a single corporation, that corporation does not have to ban open source. It can simply shape the environment so that the most convenient path is the one that keeps everything inside its walls. An AI tool like Copilot can quietly pull attention away from original projects and toward pre-digested suggestions, with little visibility into where those ideas came from. In the long term, critics worry that this could hollow out the very communities that make open source powerful. If fewer people browse repositories, join mailing lists, or participate in issue trackers, because the AI layer gives them what they need with one prompt, then fewer contributors learn the culture and practices of collaborative development. The code keeps flowing, but the sense of shared ownership fades. The community becomes background fuel for products it does not control. So where does this go next? It would be foolish to claim that any one person, even Linus Torvalds, can see the precise future of Microsoft or of computing in general. What can be seen, though, are the incentives and the trajectory. Companies that run huge clouds, office suites, and AI platforms benefit when more of your computing happens on their servers, under their policies, and through their identity systems. The emerging idea of streaming a full desktop from the cloud is an extension of this. The line between your local machine and the company data center starts to blur. In that world, kernel-level AI integration, or tight coupling between an operating system and a proprietary assistant, is not a wild science fiction scenario. It is a plausible step in a strategy where the system is no longer just a platform for your apps, but a continuous data collection and personalization engine. The fine print will talk about productivity and safety. The business logic will revolve around subscription revenue and lock-in. The technical details may change, but the economic logic remains stable. There is also a more subtle possibility. As public pressure grows around privacy and surveillance, large vendors may respond by adding more encryption, more opt-in toggles, and better dashboards. At the same time, they can keep expanding what their systems see and analyze by default, both on your device and in the cloud. Transparency can improve at the same time that exposure grows. This does not contradict Linus Torvalds' concerns. It confirms them in a more sophisticated form. For users and developers, the remaining leverage lies mostly in awareness and collective behavior. Choosing tools that respect open standards, supporting projects that remain independent, and paying attention to how much of your workflow is tied to a single vendor are all small but concrete actions. None of them will magically break corporate power, but they can slow down the slide into a future where using a computer means accepting that everything you do is processed, indexed, and monetized by default. This is what Linus Torvalds was really right about. Not that Microsoft would never write a useful open source driver, or never ship a good feature, or never admit a mistake. He was right that a large corporation, answerable to shareholders and driven by growth, will always tend to bend open ecosystems toward its own control. It will embrace what threatens it, extend it, and then reshape the environment until real alternatives are still technically allowed. but practically sidelined. You can still choose Linux. You can still compile your own software. You can still run services on hardware you own. But every year, that path demands a little more effort, while the smooth, default path pulls you deeper into proprietary identity systems, subscription models, and AI layers you cannot inspect. That is why some people say it is already too late. Not because resistance is impossible, but because the default has become so convenient that most people will never even see a reason to resist. If you want to keep hearing the stories that companies would rather you treat as boring technical details, now is the moment to stay close. The next big shift will not be announced on stage. It will slip into an update, a terms of service change, or an AI assistant that quietly becomes mandatory. Pay attention, subscribe, and do not let them turn the end of real control over your own computer into just another feature rollout.